Hello and welcome to this video on scientists who tried to make the world a better place and succeeded in their endeavours but also failed.
Mission failed. We'll get them next time.
Sometimes spectacularly and sometimes less obviously so, but with great impact. Rather than waste time, let's get straight into it. We will start with the obvious and predictable candidates. We have Alfred Nobel and Thomas Midgley Jr. Both these were inventors and scientists who are well known? Infamous might be a better term. Admittedly, for somewhat diametrically opposed reasons, but both had the same goal: make the world better. In terms of pure good intentions that turned sour, Midgley's definitely the more obvious. He was a major player in the gasoline or petrol products industry and had the idea of adding lead to fuel. The purpose of this was to reduce the effect of knocking, or when fuel combusts incompletely and somewhat sporadically in the chamber. This is good for engines and very bad for people and the environment. Ironically, about 2 years later, Midgley had to take a holiday to deal with the effects of lead poisoning. Within a year of taking up the role as the lead scientist in this, at least 10 employees were dead from lead, and many others were ill. More deaths, hallucinations, and mental illness were to follow before he moved on to other things. As should be well known by now, and obvious from the effects, this was both a health and environmental disaster for a range of reasons. However, this is not Midgley's only legacy. This poor bastard has two claims to fame, or more accurately infamy, and we can only presume that he's found the bad luck genie, or somehow or other pissed off an eldritch being who's cursed him for his entire life. The other is Freon, or as it is also known as CFCs. The gas that's eating away the ozone layer, at least it was until we stopped using it. Freon became a very common choice of both refrigerant for things like refrigerators, freezers, air conditioners and more, but also a wildly popular propellant. It was used in all kinds of aerosol products like spray paint chemicals, lining for various products, even asthma inhalers. The problem is kind of simple. When they first started developing this, they started with the assumption that there was no way this would break down and produce something toxic or dangerous. They thought that the stability of the carbon-fluorine bond would be so great that it just wouldn't ever cause any harm, and therefore there'd be no breakdown products. The primary cause of ozone depletion is when you have the CFCs, that is the chlorine-containing compounds, exposed to UV light. Unfortunately, in the presence of UV light, they will dissociate and release their chlorine, and then this goes on to catalyze with the ozone, causing its destruction. Now, that's already bad enough, but it gets worse. The atmospheric impact of CFCs are not just because they damage the ozone layer, but because they also have a peculiarity when it comes to their wavelength. They will absorb the infrared band, and they will hold on to it much better. This means Earth stays hotter. Yeah. The guy contributed to global warming in two separate ways. In 1944, he committed self-delusion with a self-designed and made helping gallows of sorts, which, all things said and done, isn't that surprising. The other example we've already mentioned is not so much remembered for their harm as it has largely been superseded by the Nobel Prize today. But Nobel invented, or at least closely linked to, why the prize exists. Nobel first invented what would ultimately become a superior version of dynamite. That is gelignite and ballistite. These were much safer than existing choices for making things go boom. A boon in a time when black powder or similar were really the only viable large-scale alternative other than dynamite, and dynamite had big issues around its stability. That meant that Nobel made a fortune on these new explosives. Explosives that were also emerging at the same time as high power and large caliber artillery and similar were increasingly popular amongst various military forces. The ability to lob a container full of TNT equivalent miles or kilometers away and have it explode is very attractive to any military, and so naturally this is where his work was partly funneled into. Not so much from Nobel's wishes, although this was rather a predictable result, but simply because development of technology, and particularly military technology, took full advantage of his discovery. And the carry-on is that Nobel contributed extensively to the wholesale slaughter and death of both civilians and non-combatants in war zones, along with, obviously, combatants. Obviously, there are benefits of this that are notable, and certainly it's not as though this is without any value whatsoever. For example, safer explosives in a confined space like a mine are always a welcome thing. His creation was stable, safe, and exploded readily when required, and not unexpectedly. This is why his work is arguably overshadowed by an apocryphal tale. At least it's the reason why he created the Nobel Prize. Apocryphal story goes that Nobel was thought to be dead, obituaries were made, and a lot of the obituaries reference the fact that he was supposed to be attributing, or at least responsible for, the wholesale slaughter from his creations. As such, he decided, well, if I'm going to be remembered for having killed everybody, I'm going to make a prize, and I will make people the best at something. Medicine, peace, literature, etc. And this is basically where he put most of his money to once he was dead. In a rather less obvious example, but of a similar pathway, that is civilian use to military use, we have Fritz Haber. This name might not be known to you necessarily. He was a German chemist who found a way to synthesize ammonia from atmospheric gaseous nitrogen and hydrogen, although later on they used other, more reliable methods of sourcing these base reagents. This led to the creation of synthetic fertilizers. That alone is a huge boon in the 1920s or thereabouts. At this time, mechanization of farms was still ongoing, if not in many places still the very early days. Yields were much smaller than today by log values. The cultivars of various grains and similar were not yet bred to current or even remotely current standards, and this meant anything to make yields better was not just important to both security but also to farm success. Prior to this, the best choice to use for things that would provide nitrogen was something like, say, bat guano or bat poop, a very rare and very valuable commodity. Replacing the synthetic nitrate-based fertilizers meant basically half the world's population could be supported on the crops grown with the Haber-Bosch process. However, Haber was a big fan of the extra spicy section of the chemistry cookbook, and not so fond of the Hague Conventions of 1907. This led to him being involved in the creation of chlorine gas amongst other chemical weapons. On the other hand, he was very much involved in the creation of not just gas masks, but the filter and media used within them. Later, his lab team would go on to work on Zyklon A, a relative and precursor to Zyklon B. This is also better known as the cyanide gas used to euthanize or genocide various peoples or groups in the concentration camps in Nazi Germany. You can certainly consider the man someone with two very diametrically opposed, let's say, views. Keeping on the topic of agricultural discoveries turned horror show, we have Arthur Gelston. In the 1940s, Arthur Gelston was working on a way to make soybeans grow faster, and he was actually quite good at this. He came up with a product, let's call it. It was called 2,3,5-triiodosabenzoic acid. This was great in that it would make soybeans grow very well, but when you applied in large quantities, it killed the plants. It's a perfect example of dose makes the poison, or at least in this case, it's dose makes bigger soybean plants or sludge. Military researchers, particularly during the Vietnam era,
I want to see you do your stuff with them. Out there, okay? Smell that? You smell that? Napalm, son. Nothing else in the world smells like that. I love the smell of napalm in the morning.
were very interested in his product, let's call it. It more or less led directly into the invention of Agent Orange. This is a, let's call it a herbicide to be polite about it, used extensively in the Vietnam War to basically kill off large areas of the Vietnamese jungle and find out where the Viet Cong were so they could then drop massive bomb loads on them. So a double whammy. First you kill off the plants, and then you kill off the people. Now, this was theoretically great, except for the fact that America has a particular habit of blue on blue, or that is, friendly on friendly fire, which contributed arguably more to American deaths in Vietnam than the actual enemy did. But that aside, What happened was very simple. Gelston heard reports that his invention was being used, and he thought, alrighty, I need to find out what's going on here. And he went to Vietnam and saw, holy shit, what are they doing with what I've made? And, well, yeah. It did lead to the creation of a new word that is attributed with, ecocide, so that was technically another invention of his. Now, the Air Force has insisted that Agent Orange didn't hurt people, and that's why technically it's not considered chemical warfare. But no matter how much they try and, let's say, green coat strategic gardening, it was pretty damn bad. The reason for it is simply that the process of the breakdown and production of this Agent Orange basically leads to the creation of dioxins. Dioxins that are, well, they're really bad for humans. We'll put it that way quite simply. One of the major things they can cause is cancer, along with a range of other issues such as birth defects. It's a phenomena that the USA and the US Air Force are more than less is denied to this day, for rather obvious reasons regarding litigation and responsibility. Bringing us further forward in time, we have thalidomide. Now, thalidomide is famous for the thalidomide scandal, which should kind of tell you what's going to happen. In 1952, thalidomide was synthesized by the chemical industry Basel, and, well, it was found to have no particular effects on animals, but it also didn't really have any benefits at the time, so it went in the bin. However, the records were kept, fortunately and unfortunately. In 1957, the company was bought out by another company again, and they found that when they were working with this, that they could isolate a particular analog of glutathione. Now, this was a useful sedative, but it didn't really necessarily prove particularly useful as it was. But through a bit of tinkering and alterations, they could produce what would eventually become thalidomide. Now, the toxicity of this was examined in animal studies, so they thought, okay, we've tested in animals, there's no obvious effects, it's safe, we're good to go. And so it was released in 1956 as a sedative. The catch to this is that, much like today, they don't test it on pregnant women, and for good reason. But this was something of an oversight. But one of the things they didn't, let's say, predict or expect was that thalidomide would be used as an antiemetic and also was particularly useful at inhibiting morning sickness. These are things that pregnant women are particularly prone to. So guess who got prescribed it? If you guess pregnant women, you win the internet for today. But you also kind of should have been on the board at the time and told them, maybe we should check that because throughout the 1950s and 60s, more and more children in many, many countries were being reported as being born with various deformities. You can probably expect what the link is here, thalidomide. Now, there were more than 10,000 children in 46 countries who all had these deformities, and they were all as a consequence of thalidomide. The most obvious for many children was the long bones in their body who just did not grow. And this meant you had children with, at best, stumpy arms and legs, at worst, basically no arms and legs, and they might have hands and feet attached to their torso. And even that was a long shot. So, yeah, this was a terrible, terrible thing. Now, how bad it, let's say, became was very much down to when the mother started taking thalidomide. There was a series of windows that were more important when we look at just when children became essentially deformed and how badly so. So the worst case scenario was when you started it between day 20 and day 36. Anything that occurred sort of outside that range had differing effects again, and we have a whole video dedicated to it, but in short, this was a shit show of monumental proportions. The last example we have for you is something that's still current, amphetamines, and not Breaking Bad kind of amphetamines, at least at first. Amphetamines are the source of Florida Man superpower and arguably a scourge in the rest of the world, when not seen in the context of Florida Man reports. The drugs were initially synthesized in 1887 by a Romanian chemist called Lazar Adler, who was working in Germany at the time. And methamphetamines followed in 1893 in Japan, and then another version again in Japan a second time. Now, somewhere around 1935, although depending on who you ask, it could be as early as 1914, there's this little thing called World War II that started. You may not have heard of it, but it was kind of important. Now, obviously political and military history importance, but also a second kind of importance that's not so obvious. Drugs. Lots and lots of drugs. Now, Germany and Japan particularly were fond of this, but it's not to say America hasn't used it, and they were still using it for pilots up until Desert Storm. So bear that in mind. At least in Germany and in parts of Japan, you could get meth without a prescription. Yeah. And of course, not only could civilians get it, but the military was giving it out in ration packs for a long time. Your ration pack includes some sort of strange congealed meat product, maybe some crackers, and a few shards of crystal meth. Everybody's favourite lunch. Breakfast of champions and all that nonsense. Well, not in the case of Germany, in fact, it's the breakfast of losers. Despite that, Germany used it extensively in the military, and they certainly started to roll it back once they realised this is a terrible idea and it's actually causing soldiers to die. But they only realised that after they'd taken over Poland, so there's a bit of a shadow over whether or not it was useful or not. In Japan, however, things are a little bit different. The civilian population was using it very extensively, and at the end of the war, when Japan surrendered, there were warehouses full of it. So, organised crime at the time figured, you know what? There's an excellent market here. We've just given access to these massive military warehouses via corruption, full of meth that we can sell, and we have a very deep consumer base. If nobody knows, then nobody's breaking the law. So, yeah. You basically had civilians who were familiar with using it, who now wanted access that they weren't allowed to before now, and in this case, Yakuza, trying to sell it to them, and everybody was winning. Well, everybody except the other countries that now had a flood of amphetamine coming into them from Japan, where it was suddenly being released out of those military warehouses. And of course, because the victorious allies had opened their markets and doors to Japan in an effort to help them rebuild or recover post-World War II, they were naturally more than willing to receive shipments from there. This led to a huge influx and a huge spike in the use of meth in other countries, and essentially helped, in part, to kickstart the, in this case, meth epidemic in parts of the world. And you can trace it all back to one Paul Barson in 1887 who synthesized it. These are the historically notable, but by no means exclusive, examples of both inventors and their inventions that were made with good intentions and became the basis of what could be called carelessness at best and malicious intentions often. In the worst case, it is simply evil. And now we need to wait and see if things like AI, social media, and furries or veganism go the same way. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. And please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.